Kate and I have been looking forward to this time to be with you. And oh, by the way, I want you to know that she and I are also planning in late October and early November. I am going to a certain country over in Asia called Korea. And this is my first time and Kate's first time to Korea. Neither of us have ever been to Korea. And so I will be speaking at the seminary there and preaching at one or two of the churches there on a Sunday. I don't know whether you'll allow me to do this, but he did such a good job translating for me last night. Maybe you'll allow me to take your pastor with me to Korea to translate. Okay, all right. I'm sure there'll be others there who can translate for me as well. But no, seriously, Dr. Park did a superb job of translating last night, didn't he? And so I love working with him and thankful, appreciative of his work last night. But Kate and I are very excited about our opportunity to go to South Korea. And so we look forward to that. And you pray for us in that endeavor. And I'll be teaching there, preaching there, probably doing a preaching conference. In fact, I will be doing a preaching conference there for pastors. And so it will be a wonderful time. And we look forward to that. Well, here we are this morning, and we want to talk about the book of Hebrews. And we have one session until 10:30, and then we have a break, and then we'll have session number 2. Now, I have a tendency, when I get going, I have a tendency to talk rather fast. Is that okay? I don't want to be, I know that all of you understand the English generally very well, but I don't want to go too fast. So if I get so excited I'm running too quickly and you want me to slow down, just sort of wave at me and say, would you slow down a little bit, or whatever the case may be, and I will do the best, the very best that I can. Now, before we do anything else, it's always important when you talk about and study a book of the Bible to know something about the background of that book. And one of the key aspects of the background of any book of the Bible is who wrote it, the question of authorship. When it comes to the book of Hebrews, Hebrews is the only truly anonymous book in the New Testament. We know who wrote all of the other books of the New Testament, but we do not know who wrote the book of Hebrews. The author does not name himself, and there is no clear early church tradition. There are traditions, plural. There are several guesses, but actually we do not know who wrote the book of Hebrews. I became very interested in that subject when I was in college. And that interest continued through the years. And when I did my doctoral work at the University of Texas at Arlington, I wrote my PhD dissertation on the question of the authorship of the book of Hebrews. And I did a comparison of the Greek New Testament, the writings of Paul, and some of the other New Testament authors. And I came up, I used an early computer program in the mid-1980s to do this work, comparing the Greek text. It was a very early linguistic computer program, and used that to compare the grammar and vocabulary and style of some of the writers of the New Testament. So I want to suggest to you in a moment who I think wrote Hebrews, and it will be a surprise to some of you. But before I do that, there are 3 main theories. Now, there are a number of theories, a number of names that have been listed throughout church history, but there are 3 major theories as to who wrote Hebrews: Paul, Apollos, and Barnabas. All right? Talk about those 3 quickly. I want to just do a little bit of this, and then we'll get into the book itself. The common theory is, or the most believed theory in terms of just general Christians everywhere, is maybe Paul is the author. Now, most New Testament scholars do not think Paul was the author. the author does not name himself, so we don't, if Paul is the author, and he could have been, he does not tell us he is like the other 13 letters that Paul wrote in the New Testament. But one theory is that Paul is the author of Hebrews. That is a possibility. And some of the arguments in favor of Paul is the fact that he wrote 13 other letters in the New Testament. He was the most famous apostle there in the days of the early church. The fact that the letter to the author of Hebrews refers to Timothy in chapter 13. He calls him our brother Timothy. And of course, Timothy was a close associate with Paul. Also, the conclusion of Hebrews, the last chapter, reads like a closing letter of Paul. Very similar there. So for these reasons, and there's some vocabulary similarity, some words that occur in Hebrews that only occur in the 13th Pauline letter. So those four arguments can be used to support Pauline authorship. However, the reason many people don't think Paul wrote Hebrews is there's no strong early church tradition in favor that Paul wrote it. There's an early anonymous tradition that was floating around. Some said Paul may have been the author, but there's no strong Pauline authorship or evidence in the early church. Secondly, Paul's letters all begin the same way. Paul, an apostle of Christ to the church at Rome, or Ephesus, or to the Philippians. Hebrews has no such opening. It does not have the traditional opening that we find in all of Paul's letters. Furthermore, and the major reason why we don't think Paul wrote Hebrews is the style of the book of Hebrews is different from the other 13 letters that Paul wrote. Now, there is some similarity, but there's a lot of stylistic differences. Now, for example, if I were to, well, I couldn't do this, so let me, because I can't read Korean, so let me utilize a different way of illustrating it. If each of you supplied 13 letters, okay, 13 letters that you wrote, all right, 13 of your letters that you wrote, and if you supplied those, all right, to me and allowed me to look at your 13 letters if I could read Korean, or if you were to write them in English, either way. And then if your pastor supplied me one letter that he had written, all right, one letter that he wrote, and the 13 letters that came from you as the individual author, if I were to look at those letters, I would find certain similarities. I would be able to discern favorite words or phrases or the way you use participles or infinitives or something. If I could look at 13 of your letters, I could discern something of your style. All right? But if we compared Dr. Park's letter to your 13 letters, there would be some differences there because of different authors. You wrote 13. You are the same author of 13 letters. He's the author of one letter. His letter might have some similarities with yours, some vocabulary similarities, but there would be a different style. That's what happens when we compare Hebrews to the 13 letters of Paul. They don't appear to be in the same stylistic manner. And that's something that's important to take note of. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the 13 letters of Paul, the phrase, in Christ, or the phrase, in Christ Jesus, occurs about 160 some odd times. 160 times. How many times does that phrase occur in the book of Hebrews? 0. Never. And see, it's things like that. Those are just interesting. And one of those would not be enough to disprove authorship, but if you get 20 or 30 of those, then it becomes less obvious, or it becomes more obvious and less probable that Paul wrote the letter to Hebrews. So, you say, well, David, I believe Paul wrote Hebrews. You're in good company. A lot of people believe that. And it may be the case. We get to heaven, we find out Paul wrote it, perhaps. But my study of the Greek New Testament, comparing the language and style, I don't think Hebrews was written by Paul. I think it was written by a close associate of Paul, someone maybe in the Pauline circle, but I don't think it was written by Paul. All right? So we put Paul aside for a minute. Number 2, Apollos. We don't know much about Apollos, but what we do know comes from the book of Acts and Corinthians. And we know that Apollos was mighty in the Scriptures. That's how he's described. Luke describes him that way, mighty in the Scriptures. And we know that he was a traveling companion of Paul. And we know that he was Jewish and a convert to Christianity. And so he would seem to have the power, the rhetorical preaching power that we find in the book of Hebrews. But, interestingly enough, Apollos was from the city of Alexandria. And in the early church, there was a tradition of authorship that grew up in Alexandria called the Alexandrian tradition. But no one in the early church, or in the first 200 or 300 years of church history, ever suggested that Apollos was a possible author of Hebrews. That's interesting that even the hometown would not select their hometown boy as a possible author. And so Apollos was never suggested as an author of Hebrews until Martin Luther in the Reformation. Luther was the very first person to suggest Apollos as a possible author of Hebrews. Also, Apollos did not write anything that we know of, so there is no way to compare Apollos with Hebrews. All right? Let's go to the third major candidate, Barnabas. We all know about Barnabas, right? He comes in the early chapters of the book of Acts. And he is a traveling companion of Paul. He and Paul are on those missionary journeys together. Barnabas was a Levite. All right, that means that he worked in the temple along with the priests. He was a Levite. He was, in other words, an associate pastor. He was a musician, so to speak, involved in the Levitical work. And Barnabas could be the author of Hebrews, but the arguments against him are, well, he didn't write anything. There's no writing that he did. And it's interesting that even though he traveled with Paul, there's no indication that he was a teacher or a writer of anything that like the book of Hebrews. That doesn't mean he couldn't do it or didn't do it, but it just makes it much less likely. But a popular theory is that Barnabas wrote Hebrews. But I want to suggest to you that I think the author of Hebrews is actually none of those. I think the author of Hebrews is Luke, who wrote Luke and Acts in the New Testament. And the reason I think the author of Hebrews is Luke is the stylistic similarities in the Greek New Testament between Luke and Acts and Hebrews are stronger than anything else. There's a very tight stylistic similarity. Also, in the early church, some of the earliest people said that some people think Luke wrote Hebrews because of those stylistic similarities. So there's an early tradition in favor of Luke as the author of Hebrews. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, wait a minute. The author of Hebrews is such a Jewish book, very steeped in the Old Testament and the temple and the priesthood. Why, Luke is a Gentile. Well, now, wait a minute. Time out. Hold the phone. Who told you Luke was a Gentile? The Bible doesn't say Luke is a Gentile. That's an assumption that we make because he has a Greek name. His name, Lucas, in Greek, is a Greek name. And we assume, well, he must have been Greek. He must have been a Gentile. He must not have been Jewish. Here's what's interesting. Number one, the Bible does not say that Luke is a Gentile. He may have been, but the Bible doesn't say that. Number two, in the first 500 years of church history, nobody said Luke was a Gentile either. In fact, they all thought he was Jewish. Number three, when you read the Gospel of Luke, you find a number of Jewish phrases and a Jewish style. And you find that particularly in the early chapters, chapters 1 and 2. For example, Luke begins, how does he begin the Gospel? After the prologue of the first 4 verses, verse 5, Luke chapter 1, verse 5, introduces us to a priest by the name of Zacharias. And Luke goes into a lot of Jewish background telling us about this priest. And among other things, he tells us that Zacharias was married to Elizabeth. And what's interesting is Luke records that Elizabeth was herself a daughter of a priest. Interesting. And so where does the Gospel of Luke begin? Well, it begins with Zacharias in the temple. And he is conducting the afternoon worship service, sacrificial service in the temple. That was called the Tamid service, T-A-M-I-D, the Tamid service. And all of the people would be gathered outside in the courtyard of the temple. And here is Zacharias, and he is inside the holy place, and he is trimming the wicks of the lamp, and he is doing the prayers before the altar of incense. He's taking care of business in the holy place. And then the people were waiting outside. And the people, as they waited outside, they were waiting for him to complete the service and then come out and conclude the service. Now, inside, what does Luke chapter 1 tell us happened when Zacharias was inside the temple? An angel visited him. And an angel said, Zacharias, you and your wife Elizabeth are going to have a child. Now, what was the unusual thing about that? All right, Zacharias was old, and his wife Elizabeth was past childbearing years. And on top of that, she was barren. She couldn't have children. But the angel said, you will have a child. Now, Zacharias is a typical man. He doesn't believe that he and Elizabeth can have a child. Remember the story? It's all in Luke chapter 1. And so what happens? The angel said to him, okay, you didn't believe, so when you go out of this temple to the people, you will not be able to speak. Do you remember this? Okay? Zacharias comes out of the temple, and he has to make sign language to the people because he's not able to speak. Do you happen to know what was the final action of the priest after the conclusion of the worship service? How they concluded the service in Judaism? What was the final action of the priest? The final action was the benediction, the pronouncement of benediction. And only a priest could do that. In fact, if you were Jewish and you attended a synagogue on the Sabbath in Israel, the rabbi could not pronounce the benediction. If a priest was present, the priest had to do that. And only if there were no priest present was the rabbi allowed to pronounce the benediction. That was the responsibility of the priest. And the way the priest would pronounce the benediction, at the very end of the service, he would lift his hands over the people. He would lift his hands. And with his hands lifted, he would pronounce the benediction and the final amen, and then the people would leave. So what do we read in Luke's gospel? Zacharias, the priest, comes out and he cannot speak. So what can he not do? He cannot complete the worship service. Now he's made the sacrifice, but he cannot complete the service because he cannot pronounce the benediction. All right? Everybody, are you all clear? Everybody clear? Okay. Now, fast forward in the Gospel of Luke. Go all the way to the end, to the very last chapter, chapter 24. And the last 2 verses of Luke chapter 24. Now we are on the other side of the crucifixion and the resurrection, and Jesus has taken his disciples to the Mount of Olives, and he is about to ascend back to heaven. And what do the last two verses say? What was the last act of Jesus before he ascended to heaven? What does your Bible say? He lifted up his hands and he what? He blessed them. That is the exact wording of the activity of the high priest in the Old Testament, who would pronounce the final blessing on the people on the Day of Atonement when the sacrifice had been made. It's the exact wording. And what Luke is doing, I think, is he is showing that what Zacharias the priest could not do in Luke chapter 1, now Jesus, our great high priest, concludes the ceremony. He has sacrificed himself and died on the cross, risen from the dead, and he's not only the sacrifice, but he is our priest. And like on the Day of Atonement, he lifts up his hands and he pronounces the final blessing upon the people. And I believe that what Luke is doing is he is showing symbolically that Jesus is the high priest of the people. He is now our high priest. He is the one who has made sacrifice for sins. And now he's risen from the dead, and he is our eternal high priest who brings us to God. Now, here's what's interesting. Of the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Luke has more to say about the priests and the priesthood than any of the other gospel writers. He is very interested in the temple. He has more to say about the temple than any of the other four gospel writers. It is Luke who records Jesus coming into Jerusalem, and then he goes to and from the temple, teaching in the temple precincts, and has engagement with the priest there. Luke's gospel talks about that more than any of the other gospels. Luke is interested in the priests, and he's interested in the connection of Jesus with the priests. Remember, it is Luke's gospel that records the only recorded event of Jesus when he was a child, at the age of 12. Where was Jesus at the age of 12 that Luke records? He was in the temple, engaging with the priest. You see, Luke, I wrote a whole book on this. It was my dissertation published called Luke and Authorship of Hebrews. But I go through and show how Luke is actually, the evidence is that he's Jewish. And I think Luke is Jewish, and he has a great interest in the priests. And if Luke is the author of Hebrews, then it's just a simple step from Luke, Acts to Hebrews. The style is the same. And what is one of the great themes of the book of Hebrews? The high priesthood of Jesus, who is also our sacrifice. And so it all begins to fit together. Now you say, well, I can't quite get over that Gentile name, that name Luke. Well, guess what? In the first century, Luke and the name Lucas, the Greek name, and the name Lucius were interchangeable names for the same person. Luke and Lucius. All right? And Lucas is the familiar name, and Lucius is the more formal name. In English, I don't know if this is true in Korean, but in English, people have a name and then they might have a familiar pet name. Or, for example, the name Robert in English, many times that person is called Bob. You know, hello Bob. His name is Robert, his formal name is Robert, but he's called Bob. Okay? They did that in the first century as well. Many people had two names. And many Jews had two names. They had their Jewish name, but they also had a Hellenistic kind of a Greek name as well. And we know that Lucius is a Jewish name, but Lucas is the Greek equivalent of that. And so so it would not be unusual if Luke were to have that name. Now, let's take this one step further. Everybody on this side of the room, from right down the middle on this side of the room, I want you to look up Acts chapter 20, verses 4 and 5. Everybody on this side of the room, Acts 20, 4 and 5. Right here, everybody to my left, everybody on this side of the room, look up Romans 16, 21. Romans 16, 21. Okay? So we got Acts 24 and 5 on this side. Acts chapter 20, verses 4 and 5. On this side, Romans 16, verse 21. Now, when Paul is in Corinth, he is writing the letter to the Romans. And in Acts chapter 20, we have the record of those people that were with Paul in Corinth when he wrote the letter to the Romans. All right? That's Romans 16:21 is the record, a listing of names that Paul, as he greets the church at Rome, and he's telling giving the names of some of the people that were with him when he wrote the letter to the Romans. So there's a connection between early verses of Acts chapter 20 and Romans 16, verse 21. Okay? Now, let's compare the names. Look at Acts chapter 20, verses 4 and 5, and look at the names that Paul lists that are with him. And notice that he lists people like Sopater, and notice that he lists Timothy. All right? Look at the names. Aristarchus, look at the names that are there. Okay? Now, those of you, that's in Acts 24 and 5, all right? Now, those of you that have Romans 16:21, look at the names in verse 21. Romans 16, verse 21. And what you'll notice is some of the same names are there. Timothy's name is there, all right? But notice a name in Romans 16:21 that is not listed in Acts chapter 20, verses 4 and 5. Romans 16:21, there is a person there named Lucius. Alright? So we've got names, we've got Timothy in both lists, Sopater in both lists. Lucius is in one list, but he's not in the other list. You see that? Now, what does Paul say about this Lucius who's with him, who's sending greetings to the church at Rome? What does Paul say about him in Romans 16:21? He says, Lucius, my kinsman. That means that's a Jewish phrase that means he's a Jew like I am. So the Lucius there is Jewish. But there's no Lucius in the Acts listing. But wait a minute. Who is the author of the book of Acts? Luke. And what does Luke say in verse 5? We read the names of all the people, and then in verse 5, what does verse 5 say in Acts 20? And so we sailed. We. Who also is with Paul? When Paul's writing Romans in Acts chapter 20, he's naming the names of people in Romans 16:21, all the same names. In Romans 16:21, Paul says there's Lucius with him, but in Acts account, Luke writing, he doesn't mention his name, except he says we, and so he was there. So there was in the company of Paul at the time he wrote Romans, both Luke and a Lucius. I suggest to you that they were the same person. One's the formal name, one's the more familiar name. And if that's the case, then Luke is the Lucius and Luke is Jewish. Now, let's take this a step further. You may have heard of the name Josephus. He is a Jewish historian. who lived during the time of Paul, Josephus. Josephus wrote some histories of the Jewish people. He wrote two famous books called Jewish Antiquities and a book called The Jewish Wars. And in the Jewish Antiquities, Josephus gives a chronological listing of the names of all of the high priests who served in Jerusalem from 166 BC to AD 70, a 200-year period. He lists the names of all of the high priests. Guess what? The name of the high priest from AD 37 to 41 is a very interesting name. Now, when Luke wrote Luke and Acts, in the prologue of Luke and Acts, who is Luke addressing Luke and Acts to? Who is the name of the person that is being addressed in Luke 1, 1 through 4, and Acts 1, 1 through 5? Who is the recipient, the original recipient of Luke's letters? A man named Theophilus. The name Theophilus is a Greek name, means lover of God. Okay? That's another reason why many people think Luke was Greek, a Gentile. Right? We don't know who that Theophilus is. We don't really know anything about him. Whoever he is, he's someone who became a Christian. Right? So, back to Josephus. Guess what? The name of the high priest in Israel from AD 37, just 4 years after the death of Jesus and resurrection of Jesus, from AD 37 to AD 41, the name of the high priest in Israel was Theophilus. And furthermore, Theophilus did not vacate the office by death. He didn't die. He was kicked out of office by Herod Agrippa. And we don't know why Herod Agrippa kicked him out. He just kicked him out. Now watch this. Herod Agrippa, does that name sound familiar in the book of Acts? Remember, who's writing the book of Acts? Luke. And in Acts chapter 13, Luke records the death of Herod Agrippa. You remember the unusual story? He made himself like a god, and God smote him, and he died, you know. You remember that story? So Luke is taking precious space to write about the death of Herod Agrippa. Why would he do that? Maybe because his recipient, Theophilus, was the very person that Herod Agrippa had kicked out of office years earlier. Now, why would Herod Agrippa, a Jew, kick a high priest out of office? Well, if that high priest had become a Christian, he couldn't stay in the temple. And it might be that Herod Agrippa kicked him out because he became a Christian. Now, one last thing on this, and we'll tie it all together. Acts chapter 6, verse 7. What does Acts chapter 6, verse 7 say? Luke records, a great company of the priests became obedient to the faith. What does that mean? It means that many of the priests in Israel became followers of Jesus. A great company of the priests became obedient to the faith. They turned to Jesus as their Messiah. Maybe Theophilus was one of them. And that may be why he was kicked out of office. So when you begin to put all of this together, you've got Luke's interest in the high priest as evidenced in Luke and Acts. You have his name, the fact that Luke and Lucius are interchangeable names. He may himself have been Jewish. He has an interest in the high priest. The language of Luke and Acts, now we're just to the Greek style language, the stylistics to look at it, is very similar to the book of Hebrews, closer to Hebrews than any other book in the New Testament. 53 words are found in the book of Hebrews that are only found in Luke and Acts. So maybe Luke is the author of Hebrews as well. And he's talking about Jesus, the high priest. And maybe Luke is writing the book of Hebrews to a group of those former Jewish high priests who have become Christians. and who then were run out of town in Acts chapter 8 because of the persecution of Stephen. And it says that many of the Christians fled except the apostles who stayed, and they relocated, and some of them relocated in the city of Antioch in Syria. And we know that a number of the priests were relocated there that were converted to Christ. And maybe, and there are a number of New Testament scholars, I tend to agree with this, that Hebrews was written to a segment of the church, the Jewish believing segment of the church in Antioch, which was the sending missionary church for Paul and Luke. And that Luke, now after the death of Paul dies in Rome, AD 67. Paul says in his last book, 2 Timothy, only Luke is with me. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Everybody else is gone. Paul's about to die. Only Luke is with me. So that Paul dies, and then Luke writes a letter to the Christians to encourage them to keep on keeping on. And he's writing to those Jewish priests back in Antioch. That's a possible theory. Nobody can prove it. I don't claim that I know that for a fact. I'm certainly not dogmatic about any of it. But it all fits together. Now here's the other interesting thing. At the very end of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews refers to Timothy. But he refers to Timothy in a different way than Paul refers to Timothy. Every time Paul talks about Timothy in the Bible, he calls him my son. My son, Timothy. The author of Hebrews calls Timothy our brother. He doesn't call him my son. He calls him our brother. So that would be another reason why maybe Paul didn't write it. But someone close to Paul in the Pauline circle did. Who was closer to Paul than Luke? And oh, by the way, what was Luke's vocation? He was a doctor. He was a physician, right? Guess what? You have 6 medical terms that occur in the book of Hebrews. 3 of them that occur only in the Gospel of Luke or Acts in the New Testament. So you begin to put all of this together, and I would suggest to you that the best argument for the best possibility for the author of Hebrews is Luke, who wrote Luke and Acts. Traveling companion of Paul, and that Luke is himself Jewish. Now, can I prove any of that? I can prove some of it. I can prove that Theophilus was the name of the high priest. You know, I can prove all of that. But can I prove that Luke wrote Hebrews? I cannot. But neither can you prove that Paul or anybody else wrote Hebrews. But I would suggest to you that that is a reasonable theory that has a lot of facts that seem to fit the theory. And I think that that's the best case that can be made for the authorship of Hebrews. Okay? Now, okay, it took probably more time than we should have on that. But we're not going to talk about other aspects of the background of Hebrews. I think that Hebrews was written to Jewish believers. Where they were located is anybody's guess. I think they were located in Antioch, but we don't know. Whoever the author was, we think he's writing from Rome to the Christians back somewhere east, either in Jerusalem or a place like Antioch or whatever, because at the very end of the Hebrews chapter 13, what do we read there in verse 24? They of Italy greet you. So it would seem the author is in Italy and he's writing, he's saying, believers here with me, which would mean probably he's in Rome, and he's writing to believers back toward Jerusalem or somewhere in that neighborhood. And of course, we know who was with Paul in Rome when he died. Luke. And the book of Hebrews was probably written somewhere between AD 67 and AD 70 before the fall of the temple. So I think all of these things make good sense. You can make a good case for all of these things. Now, I have given you a handout with a lot of this and a lot more information that you can have, and you can sort of go through and see what's happening there. Also on this handout is a full outline of the book of Hebrews. This will be very helpful to you in your Bible study. And later, I've outlined the book of Hebrews structurally for you in terms of how semantically the book develops. There are 2 or 3 pages there for you, and that will be very helpful to you. Okay? Now, so the question becomes, okay, after all of that, the question is, well, what is the theme or the purpose of the book of Hebrews? Now, clearly the book of Hebrews has a lot of doctrine in it that talks about the high priesthood of Jesus and His atonement for our sins. That's a very big part of the book of Hebrews. So the author is teaching us about Jesus, who is our high priest, who is our sacrifice. How the Old Testament temple has been superseded. Now we have the New Testament. Now we have the church. Now we have Christ as our sacrifice. So we don't have to bring animal sacrifices anymore. So all of that is a part of the doctrine of the book of Hebrews, right? But now the question is, well, why is the author writing? What is his purpose in writing? And this is where we come to what we call the warning passages in Hebrews. And in a moment we're going to take a break and then we're going to come back and we'll talk about what do the warning passages in Hebrews mean and who are they warning and what are they warning about. But I do want to give you the basics of that. If you will notice in your handout on page 3 under purpose. Everybody see that? Page 3 under purpose. The question is, how do we relate these warning passages? There are 5 key warning passages in Hebrews. Go to the bottom of page 3, and there you have them listed. 2:1 through 4, 3:7 through 4:13, 5:11 through 6:12, 10:26 through 39, 12:14 through 29. These are the warning passages. Now, the book of Hebrews is written to believers. It's written to Christians. And it is written primarily to them to encourage them to press on to maturity. Not to lose heart. Not to quit when the going gets tough. When there are problems and persecution and trials. The author of Hebrews knows that the Christians are struggling. It's hard to be a Christian in the Roman Empire in the 1st century. In fact, some of the Christians were martyred. And therefore, over time, 30 to 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, with all of the pressure against Christians, some Christians were struggling. And the author of Hebrews is writing to encourage them and to challenge them to keep on going. Don't quit. Don't drop out. And furthermore, he's warning them that if they don't press on to maturity, then as believers they risk God's discipline in their life. And the warning passages are written to believers. They're written to believers. So what is the purpose of the book? And it's a warning to Jewish believers, and thus to all of us today, all Christians today, about the consequences of failure to press on to maturity. Now, one of the ways we see that is in Hebrews chapter 6, at the very center of the book. Hebrews 6, verse 1 says this: leaving behind the elementary principles, literally in Greek that phrase means the ABCs of doctrine, the ABCs of the gospel, the basics of Bible doctrine. What does the author say? Leaving that behind, all right, let us press on what? To maturity. That is a very important verse in Hebrews, because the author is writing to believers who already have doctrinal knowledge. They're already Christians, but they need to be encouraged to press on to maturity. Press on in your knowledge of the Scriptures and your relationships with Christ and your relationships with one another. press on to maturity. Don't drift. Don't drop out when the going gets tough, but press on. Now, we are in a different circumstance than Christians were in the first century, at least in one sense. In this country, we are not physically persecuted for being believers, in the sense of being threatened with death, put in jail. We don't face that kind of persecution, though we may someday. But there are other countries, as you well know, where believers in some of those other countries do face persecution, just like they did in the first century. So whether we are Christians in Korea, Russia, China, America, South America, Africa, wherever we are today, there are still some believers who are persecuted for their faith, and others who just face the normal attacks of Satan and the trials of life. And you just sometimes wonder, is it really worth it to keep on keeping on with Christ? I've got so many problems and financial pressure and family problems or whatever. Is it really worth it to continue to live for Jesus? And the author of Hebrews is writing to say it's worth it. It's worth it all to stay true to Jesus, to press on to maturity. Don't quit. He's worth it. And so the writer's encouraging on the basis of who Jesus is and what He's done, but then he's also warning believers, don't drop out, don't drift away, because there's a price to pay if you do that. This is what's going on in Hebrews. This is why you find the alternation between encouragement but warning. He's addressing believers. And so when we come back from the break, we're going to pick up there, and we will talk about the warning passages, and particularly the most famous one in Hebrews 6, and we're going to try to determine what does it mean. There are four major ways, four major views of interpreting the warning passages. Three of them are wrong. I'm going to tell you which one's right. Which one at least I think is right, anyway. If you choose a different one than me, that's all right. That's no problem. But this is what we will talk about when we come back. And also, at the end of that session, we'll take 15 minutes for questions and any questions you may want to have, and I will try to answer them for you. And I'll do my best, but if I can't answer them, Miss Kate will answer them. So we're going to get your questions answered. So we'll look forward to that as well. All right? So, Sam, you come and we'll take this break and then we'll go forward.
Let's get a round of applause.